I believe that religion is at the bottom of all of the world's problems because the people who are in power have given us our governments, our legislatures, our laws, our institutions of higher learning. They've also given us our governmental systems, and they've given us all our religions. Religions come from the same people who have given you your banking system, your governmental systems, so that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are nothing more than Masonic concoctions to entertain the masses, to entertain the people and keep them occupied. And this is, of course, what George Carlin was talking about when he said it's a big club and you ain't in it. Because the religions of this world are designed purposely to distract your mind and to give you something to hope for. While the people who came up with these ideas in England know what they're doing. They are subverting the human race. What we're seeing today is the human family on the earth is being mutated. The reason why we have major wars in the world, all kinds of people have all kinds of ideas about why we have different wars and what all of these wars are all about. Wars are for one reason only, and that is to guide the human race. To guide the human race into a particular realm of thinking. Because if you have peace around the earth, everybody would get together and do things together, but that's not what the masters who own us, who think that they own us, want. So they create wars, which then feeds violence, it feeds pornography, it feeds all kinds of debasement in the human being, and therefore they're dropping down and mutating the human family and rebuilding us through video games and through television, propaganda, etc. So it's a very, very serious thing which is now facing the earth. And most of the people in the world today have no idea in the world what's going on and how this stuff really works. I was fascinated to learn how government works. One of the nice things about my life is that I've been able to meet a lot of very interesting people. And when I discovered how government really works, I was amazed at how commerce, government, religion, all work together, and everything is well planned out. And so until and unless the people of America and the people of the world awaken to how this stuff really works, we are a doomed species. Because we're being fed propaganda and lies and mistruths, and it's very frightening because I know where we're being led. So I wanted to talk tonight about religion and government. And Moses was the great lawgiver, we're told. When you find out that, and it won't take very long if you start doing some research on your own, you'll find out that Christianity and Judaism and Islam, the three of those three religions are referred to as the people of the book, because all three rely on a book for their religious teachings. The Quran, the Bible, and the New Testament. I believe the New Testament is a metaphor, and I'm going to give some lectures on that later. But Judaism today is actually Hinduism. It's connected through the ancient Hindus, many of their teachings called Brahmanism. And you put an A in front of Brahma, it becomes Abrahma or Abraham. And so this whole religious thing about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of this stuff is Hinduism. And when you find out how the old ancient Phoenician Canaanites were the bankers, the politicians in the Middle East, they picked up on the old Hindu stuff and a lot of the teachings coming out of Egypt and fashioned a new religion called Judaism. And out of Judaism comes Christianity. So
joining me today. Before I get started, I want to draw attention to the fact that Algeria and Pakistan shocked the world. They came out against Israel. So, they came out after the U.S. vetoed the Gaza ceasefire. People are getting done. Anyway, so the clip for that is below. So, the clip you heard at the intro is a man named Jordan Maxwell. He, of course, is controlled opposition. He goes on to say a lot more things in the clip. I only played a small portion of it. He said that Judaism is really Hinduism. Yeah, there's a lot of information that seems to make sense, but for today's purposes, I want to focus on things that I can also verify, because controlled opposition people mix in a lot of things, and I don't, I'm encouraged to hear about Judaism and Hinduism, and I certainly will explore it later, but I'm not going to publish it today. But I'm not also gatekeeping, because the whole clip is down below. But yeah, Hinduism coming from Judaism, yeah, when I looked into it, it does make a great deal of sense. But anyway, so I just clipped a portion of what he was saying. Because I learned a lot from Jordan about this admiralty law and stuff like that. But today's show, I plan to cover this whole deal with slavery, debt, and how the education built elite powers and rewrote our history. And also a key thing about Israel, and then hopefully we'll get off of this Israel subject. But Israel has no borders or constitution. And I found a very fascinating clip about Israel and the Palestinian and British thing that I plan to play. It's actually one of the better clips, and it'll pull all this together. And funny thing, when I was listening to the clip, I looked at the video portion of it, and what do I see? A group of men standing around with fez hats. So, I don't know if they're Ottoman or where that year that was from, but anyhow, I'll get back to that. But anyway, so, because really where they're getting all this money comes out of universities and places like that, and that all comes out of tax dollars. And banks these days are really using education kind of not banks, universities are really banks, and education is their side gig. And at the end of the show, I have a story about baby products and how low they will go to destroy us. I have never once said, share this information, get it out to everybody you know. But I'm begging you to share this with anybody you ever met or will ever know in the future. This is pretty critical information going on right now with the little baby. So anyway, so let's keep going here. Okay, so just to give you an idea, I'm going to give you an example of some of this university business before I get to all of the business with why they don't have borders or constitution and all those other things. So, in 2023, taxpayer funding funded the military and defense area, $798 billion. In the same time frame, high tech, the Silicon Valley bros and their contractors, just the top 5 firms got $153 billion. And universities, that's where they hide a lot of this stuff. Just federal and R&D shares, they get $60 billion per year as of 2023. And universities like MIT, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, UC Systems receive billions in Federal Reserve money, roughly $60 billion. So that's a lot of money, right? And research often starts as basic science, okay? And I'm going to be getting to this history of science a little bit more here. So students and researchers who cut their teeth on these projects then spin out companies or get picked up by contractors. So it's just a pipeline from universities to commerce, right? And let's give you an example of somebody who's in the news today. Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison is buying Paramount Pictures and CBS and for his son. So yeah, he's investing a lot in media. And I think he's part of the group that's buying TikTok. But anyway, don't quote me on that. But there's a group of them buying TikTok now. And they're all pro-Zionist, right? Okay, so, let me see here, wait a second. I think I was causing some problems with the microphone by handling it too much, so I'm trying to be cautious today. Okay, so let's start with Oracle. Oracle is a company that Larry Ellis founded, okay? Oracle originated in 1977 and is tied directly to CIA contracts. Its first major project was for the CIA called Project Oracle, which inspired the company's name. Well, Larry was enrolled at the University of Illinois, and I'll be talking more about Chicago in a minute here, in 1962, but dropped out after his adoptive mother died. He briefly attended University of Chicago in 1966, where he was exposed to computer science and programming. He never completed a degree. Instead, he moved to California and worked as a programmer for companies like Amdahl and Ampex. So in 1977, Ellison co-founded a place called Software Development Laboratories with a couple of other people. Their first big break, of course, right? They get these big breaks, right? Was a contract to build a relational database system for the CIA, codenamed Project Oracle. The project was inspired by IBM researcher Edgar Codd's 1970s paper on relational databases, which had been circulating in universities and research labs. The CIA contract not only gave them seed funding, but also validated the technology. So after the project, they renamed it Oracle Corporation. They started out as Software Development Laboratories, and after they did this project for the CIA, essentially, they named it Oracle. So even though Ellison himself dropped out, the idea and technology foundations, the relationship databases, programming languages, operating systems, all came from university research funded by federal money. Oracle is a clear example of how knowledge born in academia, sponsored by public money, turned into a private company enriched through defense intelligence contracts. So Ellison personally did not build Oracle inside of a university, but university research was the seed, and his CIA contract was the launch pad. So Ellison then went on to build Oracle, after a little help from his friends, into one of the largest software firms with government contracts as a steady backbone. And I mentioned Oracle when I was talking about Palantir. There are places like Oracle that are much bigger than Palantir, okay? Palantir is just the one they're focusing your fear on right now. But I would look closer at Oracle if I were you. Anyway, so, and this is similar. Google's early funding partly came out of DARPA. DARPA was backed research at Stanford, and that was a government program. Palantir, Peter Thiel, built his base on CIA venture arm in NQTEL contracts. So once companies are entrenched, their founders become billionaires. Larry Ellison, hold on to your hats, okay? It's hard to buy groceries right now, right? Larry Ellison is now worth well over $100 billion. He has now branched into media ownership as a way to consolidate influence. In 2024, Ellison purchased Sinclair Broadcast Group's TV stations in Texas for his son, David Ellison, who is CEO of Skydance Media, a Hollywood production company. This gives the family a foothold in both entertainment and broadcast. Media ownership fits a longer pattern. Wealth gained from public contracts and taxpayer-backed science gets recycled into shaping public narratives. It shows how publicly funded science becomes privatized wealth. Taxpayers fund the risk through universities and defense research and development. Private firms capture the profits. Then that wealth isn't just passive, it gets leveraged to buy media, fund political campaigns, and shape culture. Larry Ellison may be a high-profile case, but his pipeline has repeated with many tech billionaires who started in university research linked to federal grants. So let's talk a little bit about old Larry. Larry Ellison was born in New York City in 1944. His biological mother, Florence Spellman, was a young single woman of Jewish descent. His biological father was an Italian-American U.S. Air Force pilot who did not remain in Ellison's life. At 9 months old, Ellison was adopted by his great-aunt and great-uncle, Lila and Louis Ellison. That's where he gets the name Ellison, on the south side of Chicago. Now, you've heard me talk about Chicago quite a bit, so let me just give you a couple sentence refresher here. Chicago is where the real mob started, the group called the Outfit. Most people confuse the mafia. We think that when we hear the word mafia, we think of the New York mafia, which was really that 5-family mafia group out of New York, right? But the really dangerous mafia, well, they're all dangerous, but the worst group of them come out of Chicago. And I hope to finish Gus Russo's book before I die, but anyways, Gus Russo wrote a great book called Super Mob. And what he figured out was that early immigration, Ashkenazi Jews all founded themselves in Chicago, and that's where they started out. The Ashkenazi Jews started in Chicago, and that's exactly where people like the Hyatt Hotel comes from, those Pritzker people and all that. Yeah, they all come out of that mob group, which is out of Chicago. So, of course, when I read that he was adopted by his great aunt and great uncle in Chicago, right, south side Chicago. So, anyway, I went to look at his adoptive family's background because the minute I heard Chicago, I was thinking, what does this mean? So the great uncle was of Russian Jewish descent, part of the large immigration of Jews from the Russian Empire, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. in the early 20th century. So while Ellison was born in America, the family line he was raised in was rooted in Eastern European Jewish immigration. So, and this is probably true. He probably did grow up in a working class immigrant household in Chicago. Ellison later described his adoptive father as often unemployed and critical, which shaped Ellison's drive for independence. Could be BS or could be true, don't know. Some of the people, these gypsies, they came from literally nothing, and someone in their family, these people travel in groups, they're clans, okay? That's why when you start to look at, if you ever look into those, who they're playing as actors and stuff, because a lot of these royal people are really actors, right? And if you find them hiding out somewhere playing like Syria, for example, that guy was a royal actor, I forget, I think he was out of Spain, but anyway, so if you find one of them, you'll find the rest of them, okay? So anyway, so learn to look for their patterns, then it becomes fascinating and not that complicated. So he supposedly was growing up in a working class immigrant household in Chicago, and he had no contact with his biological father and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So his family was definitely, his adoptive family is all I couldn't find information about the mother in New York that gave him up, okay? But for sure, his adoptive family were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, in Russia specifically. So anyway, so in books like The Outfit, Gus Russo describes the Chicago Outfit, which was the city's dominant crime syndicate, and its ties to politics, unions, and business. Russo emphasized how Chicago's mob history is often overshadowed by the New York Five families, but Chicago had just as much national influence. He documents that alongside the Italian outfit, leaders like Capone, Cardo, Giaccani, there were Jewish organized crime figures in Chicago and elsewhere, many of them Ashkenazi immigrants or first-generation children of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Figures like Meyer Lansky, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik were from Chicago, were prominent Jewish mobsters. Russo shows that Jews, Italians, and Irish often work together, not separately. So anyway, so Ellison was definitely born Lawrence Joseph Ellison in New York in 1944, but I could not trace more about his mother. The mother was Jewish, that's all I could figure out. Sometimes you have to draw a line at where you go, right? But he was in fact adopted and raised in Chicago by his aunt and uncle, Lila and Louise Ellison, who were Russian Jewish immigrants. So he is firmly in that group, not guessing, right? Ellison came out of the same part of the country that's pretty mob associated, right? That Pritzker guy running around Chicago now, yeah, his family, they all come from that region. So anyway, so let's get to the show. The person, Jordan Maxwell, the person you heard on the clip. I'm not saying don't listen to him, okay? I'm saying that he is worth listening to in bits and pieces. Like all things, like let's say you hear Jordan Maxwell say something like, well, the connection between Judaism and Hinduism. Well, then what I did was I clicked into one of his shows and he said that, and I didn't hang around to hear the rest of what he had to say. I took the information and went and looked for myself. So anyway, so the late Jordan Maxwell, he's dead now, was born Russell Pine, was a self-styled researcher of religious symbolism with no formal academic credentials. He died in 2022 at age 81. And I'm just going to repeat something that I've heard. I haven't verified it. I don't have a clue, but it makes sense, okay? I have heard in my wanderings, a couple people have inferred that Jordan Maxwell also played the role of Michael Aquino. Well, it makes sense from what they talk about, right? So, Michael Aquino, I've talked about him before. He was involved in that incident out of Presidio. He was a military officer, but he was a Temple Asset guy. And anyway, so people say that Jordan Maxwell and Michael Aquino are both the same people. I think highly likely, but like I said, these things could also take up too much time than they're worth to figure out the answer, right? So I'm just going to put that out there. So, because Judaism and Hinduism are not directly related in a way that one is after the other, but both religions are among the oldest existing religions in the world, if they even exist, right? If they even exist. So, some scholars have suggested that Hinduism might have influenced Judaism. So anyway, so that's all we're going to talk about with him. So, today's show we're going to be talking about because I've also seen pictures of Golda Meir and LBJ as being the same. And just because I was feeling petty, I published those pictures over on my website in today's shows. But yeah, I did a little bit of looking around about Golda Meir and LBJ being the same person. I didn't get far enough. I tried to look for their heights. I never could find a picture of the two of them standing next to each other. The one that I really wanted to figure out was Ted Bundy. And Ted Bundy family is an old elite family name. So Ted Bundy is for sure 100% connected to all the elite families. The closest I got with Ted Bundy is he's probably playing that Clyde Bundy. Clyde Bundy was involved in all of these things. And I'll try to remember to post a link down below. Because my favorite person, that girl that named Susie Cream Cheese, she's done all those great videos that I posted over time where she's identified these royal actors. And she has a really good one about the Bundys. But I'll probably have to leave Ted Bundy alone because, first of all, it would take so much work to prove that Ted Bundy is really Clyde Bundy. I'd have to go through. It would take more work than I could do right now. So anyway, so welcome to the show. Today we're going to connect some dots between history, power, and the stories we've been told to believe. We're going to talk about some slavery to the foundation of American universities, and we're going to tie in the Khazars' role in medieval slave trade and the Great Fire of London that cleared the way for finance and empire. It's pretty interesting. I looked again at that Great Fire of London. Interesting, the area that got burned was exactly the area that the financial center is built on. What they essentially did was burn out all of those poor people living there. So anyway, so that's what we're going to take a look at. So here's what I think. I think a lot of our trouble starts with these stories that power asks us to believe. Like, religion is one of the oldest and strongest of those stories. It promises meaning, community, and a moral code. But then you peel back the cover, what kind of moral code is this when the priests are running around raping the kids and all that? But I digress. Anyway, so, but in the hand of rulers, it's also justified authority. And they always stamp laws with a divine approval. And then they turn politics into destiny. So you can see these patterns across countries when religions and states fuse. dissent becomes sin, and policy becomes fate. Wars become holy, orders become eternal, inequality becomes ordained, because I think this whole story protects the structure. Because major universities in the U.S. and abroad were either physically built by enslaved people or financed by wealth accumulated through slavery. Institutions such as Georgetown, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, and the University of Virginia have acknowledged their ties to slavery. Now keep in mind, they only acknowledged that when they got caught just a few years ago, but I'll get back to that later. But anyway, so enslaved men, women, and children were forced to build campus buildings, maintain the grounds, and provide the services for faculty and students. Endowments, donations, and land grants often came from wealthy plantation owners or merchants tied to the slave trade. And this has all been proven. Some universities produced academic theories used to justify slavery, racial hierarchy, and later systems of segregation. So yeah, the same people that were built by slaves were the same people who came out with these theories to justify slavery. And they came up with the system of segregation. This came out of these universities. So, and universities operate as more than education institutions. They function really as a pretty specific power structure. They decide what knowledge is legitimate and what is excluded. This has been historically reinforced social hierarchies, whether through curriculum that erased non-European contributions or by centering elite perspectives. They function like corporations. They extract tuition. They secure government and private funding and invest in large endowments. Their wealth often comes from systems of exploitation. Once slavery, now debt-financed tuition and low-paid staff were at these same universities. Universities do not pay well, okay? So they transmit norms and values that sustain the broader political and economic order. Elite universities in particular reproduce ruling classes by training future leaders in politics, business, and academia. Just as they once depended on enslaved workers, universities today rely on an underclass of adjunct professors, graduate assistants, and service staff who are underpaid relative to the prestige and wealth of the institution. The legacy of slavery persists in the disproportionate underrepresentation of black students and faculty, as well as in persistent racial wealth gaps that affect access to higher education. And just a little history about slaves. Slaves were often captured from Slavic, Finnic, and Turkic tribes in Eastern Europe and their steppes. This is where the very word slave comes from Slav, reflecting how many Slavic people were taken and sold in these markets. Some of these universities now engage in projects of reckoning, memorials, research initiatives, and limited reparation programs, but critics argue these measures often fall short of true redress. The way universities consolidate power through slavery mirrors how they consolidate wealth and privilege today through exclusivism, hierarchy, and control over resources. Because let's talk a little bit about the Khazars after they got caught. The Khazar Brigade thrived on taxing and facilitating the slave trade in the 8th and 10th century. It kind of sounds like the people going around today, right? For centuries, this was an open and accepted practice in their region. But when their empire declined and internal weaknesses, they lost the ability to control or disguise their role. Other powers like the Kievan Rusians continued the trade. In other words, Khazars never formally repented or reckoned with slavery. They simply lost the capacity to manage it when their political dominance collapsed. Because as victims, they gain support, protection, and cohesion. As hidden rulers, they maintain mystique and fear, which discourages direct challenge. That's why they always have that victim role, right? And that is the role of any good psychopath. And it's the mafia image again. The Don cries persecution from the police as the victim, while secretly running the sister city as the master. That dual identity keeps the family safe. Instead of overt priestly control, they create new intermediaries who looked objective and trustworthy. This all came about at a time when people were supposedly, according to their history, getting suspicious and tired of rulers, right? And that's why they introduced these scientists and these doctors. The scientists spoke in the language of reason, not theology, which seemed above politics. Because remember, the early priests and stuff were the ones who were doing all the scientific stuff, right? So, doctors in public health manage bodies, but now with the blessing of science instead of just church, medicine, or superstition. Technocratic orders, academic societies, and later universities became the new monasteries. They controlled admission, codified knowledge, and trained the next generation of elites. And that is exactly, and it's also in the pyramid section. We got three groups: the science, the doctors, and the technocrats, right? The universities and stuff. Because what they figured out, it was actually brilliant social engineering. They figured out that people are less likely to rebel against a rational expert than a king or priest demanding obedience. The same controlling function was preserved, just under a new story. Because it's actually behind it all, it continues about control, right? Because someone then decides which research is funded. Someone decides what truth gets published. Someone decides which discoveries are weaponized for war, commerce, or propaganda. Science did not just arrive, it was constructed, institutionalized, and presented as a trustworthy new authority at the very moment the public was losing faith in kings and priests. The scientific persona is recognized by scholars as a social technology for producing consensus and directing belief. And that's exactly what I've been calling a mask. So let's take a look at this Great Fire of London, September 2 to 6, 1666. Fire destroys 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and almost all of medieval London. The blaze conveniently cleared huge areas of land right in the old financial district. So they not only blew out what paperwork was there in the old financial district, they just cleared the land, right? So they just burned it all down. So whatever they had up until that time as a financial district pretty much got burnt down, right? So within a decade, London was rebuilt with wider streets, new architecture, and a far more centralized plan. So, most parish registers, property deeds, and municipal records for the old city were lost. Now, isn't that very convenient, right? This allowed for new survey and reallocation of land. I would call this a pretty massive reset. It was a massive redistribution of property that favored financiers, merchants, and elites. Symbolically, I look at it as a ritual purification. The old medieval city, which was plague-ridden, chaotic, was literally turned to ash. So St. Paul's Cathedral and the new city churches became monumental symbols of the reborn city. So, of course, there was growth of the City of London Corporation. That's where all of this ties to. We got the City of London, we got the U.S. military in Washington, D.C., and we have the Vatican. Those three places form this pyramid, right? That financial district grew in power, setting the stage for the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. It was the rise of insurance and finance. Lloyd's of London began in the coffee houses after the fire. modern insurance was born to manage risk. So I would say that 1666 looks like a pretty ritual year, a moment when old structures were burned, literally, so that a new system could rise. And that is the same time as that religious guy was declaring himself the Messiah. And the same time they declare that sin was the way to get ahead, right? So so they took the old city, replaced by a more orderly planned one, ideal for trade and banking. So yeah, but the new order, one based on finance, science, and managed religion rather than medieval monarchy and parish life. So yeah, it was a pretty big shift. They brought in the science, they started managing the religions better. Because in 1660, the Royal Society chartered science, institutionalized a new secular authority right there. So 1665, the Great Plague of London kills 15 to 20% of the city. Good way to clean house, right? 1666, Sabati Zivi declares himself the Messiah. The Great Fire of London, 1666, opportunity for land distribution, urban redesign, and erasure of old debts and property claims. So this person called Christopher Wren leads rebuilding of London, created a new planned commercial cities. Coffee houses became centers of trade, news, and finance, and the birth of Lloyd's and the London Stock Exchange. And then in 1688, there was a glorious revolution, brings William III to power, strengthened Parliament and merchant financier class. So in 1694, founding of the Bank of England, right? So by the 1700s, 1800s, the new order was consolidated. London becomes the global financial center. British Empire expands into India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Science and enlightenment, though, justify empire and civilizing missions. We had the Jesuit suppression in 1773, but their educational model survives and shapes the elites. They had the Industrial Revolution between the 17 and 1800s, powers a new phase of global control. Because before 1666, knowledge was hoarded by monasteries and priests. After 1606, knowledge was professionalized with scientists, doctors, historians, but still gatekept by academics and the elites. So the public was given a curated version of truth, while archives like the Vatican and royal collections and secret societies retained the full record. So yeah, I think that 66 may be just a key date. So anyway, because right around that time, after the Reformation and the Jesuits' rise, universities became places to shape not just priests, but the entire elite class. Because before that, the universities were there just for the priests and stuff. And also, science became institutionalized. The Royal Society in 1660 created new channels to certify knowledge. After the chaos of the Black Death and open rebellion and church backlash, elites realized they need a better way to control the narrative. And that was a solution: create a world where the public thinks science, objective truth, but the entire framework from excavation to education is still under today elite oversight. This allows them to manage memory, which plagues, which fires, which wars, which scandals are emphasized or erased. History is, of course, written by the victors, called his story, right? After wars, revolutions, pandemics, resets, the side that wins decides what gets taught to future generations. In Cromwell's England, royalist texts were destroyed or edited. After the Great Fire, London's property records and parish documents were literally gone, allowing a new story to be written about land ownership, social order, and the city's identity. So, let's talk about the capture of memory. Universities and colleges They're created to preserve and propagate the correct version of knowledge. Church archives then kept sacred texts, banned others as heresy. Then we had state archives, centralized control over records, deciding which treaties, decrees, and correspondence survive. So, of course, the Great Fire of London in 1666 destroyed property records and parish archives, clearing the way for new structures, conveniently removing messy evidence. And we also had, I looked at other destruction of records during the Spanish Inquisition records. Many were deliberately destroyed when Napoleon invaded Spain, erasing centuries of detailed confessional surveillance. There were the colonial archives. There's probably more. I just kind of dug through a few of them. There were the colonial archives. British systematically burned or hid records from leaving colonies like Kenya and India to prevent war crimes or land theft from being used in court. Then, of course, we have the church archives. Vatican secret archives hold banned books, heretical writings, and state documents. Access is highly restricted. And of course, we have PR departments. Corporate and government communications teams manage what becomes the record. We also have think tanks and academia. They shape consensus history by funding certain research and excluding others. One of the biggest think tanks that came out of World War II was I'll have to think of the name of it, but it's a big one, and it was started by General Curtis LeMay, the one that murdered so many people in Japan. I'll have to think of the name of it, but yeah, it came right out of World War II, this think tank, right? Think tanks shape consensus history. Censorship and deplatforming. Digital tools now erase inconvenient truths faster than ever. But in ancient times, the priests taxed offerings. Kings conscripted men for wars, all in the name of divine duty. In the medieval era, they got tithes, serfdom, indulgences. The people were both the labor force and the revenue source. In the modern era, colonialization turned entire continents into resource farms for Europe, sugar, gold, and slaves. Then, of course, in the industrial age, workers were squeezed in factories while owners built mansions and dynasties. This is why they rewrite history when they are caught. They need to maintain the illusion that they are the civilizers, saviors, providers, when in reality, just my opinion, they are parasites and psychopaths on the very populations that they rule. So even when people sense things, the population senses that their labor, their children, their health are being consumed to keep the system alive. The white coats simply make it look sanitary, scientific, or sacred. And I didn't cover the butchers when I was talking about the white coats the last show I did, so let's dig into those butchers. Actually quite interesting. The butchers in ancient Israel, priests themselves slaughtered sacrificial animals wearing white linen so the blood would be visible as temple sacrifices. In the Roman religion, it's called the victimarius, or the temple butcher, wore white tunics during sacrifice. The act was both religious and practical. The guild butchers from medieval time. Butchers in Christian Europe were often semi-sacral figures connected to feast days and rituals. White coats eventually became standard for cleanliness, but the symbolic link to sacrifice remains. And this is exactly backs up my point. I am 100%, 99.9999% sure they have everybody eating meat because they want everybody to be engaging in cannibalism. And look where it all got started. So you want to laugh about me saying this now? No, I think they want, in all of these rituals, for all of these things they've done with these kids, with the adults, and I've covered them right here on this show, it always involves eating things, right? And it's usually they'll get kids to eat a baby's heart or something really insane like that. Well, that's because then later they can say, well, nobody's going to like you if you ever admit this because you're the one that ate that baby's heart. So, yeah, so they're always getting people to cannibalize things, right? I don't know. I just see a direct link between cannibalism and those butcher shops. But anyway, I need to keep moving, so. Because here's the thing, in medieval Europe, surgeons were originally barbers. They wore blood-stained aprons and white coats. As medicine becomes scientific, doctors adopted white coats to distinguish themselves from dirty street barbers and to project the sterility, authority, and moral superiority. So the white coat was the priestly role of healing, guardian of life, and trustworthy authority. So yeah, butchers wore that white coat. So yeah, I'm going to keep moving on this one because I've already covered enough, but priests handled offerings and sometimes animal sacrifice. White robes made the blood starkly visible, emphasizing the solemnity of the ritual. Butchers were often quasi-sacral figures because meat was expensive and tied to feast days. Surgeons and barbers originally wore aprons stained with blood, but later adopted white to signal cleanliness and to separate themselves from mere barbers. I think the killer is inside of the house, and that's usually used in horror stories, that the danger is out there somewhere. But it's already in your safe space, already part of your world. So this is exactly how this white garment trick works. It doesn't look like an enemy. It looks like a savior, a healer, a holy man, a scientist. It comes inside the village, the temple, the court, the school, the hospital, and becomes part of daily life. Priests sat in the courts of kings, heard their confessions, controlling rulers from within. The butchers were the executioners. They authorized killings done legally, not seen as murder, but as justice or sacrifice. The doctors and the scientists, they mediate, they cut, they inject, and experiment under the sign of progress. Modern corporations like CEOs in lab coats, pharma ads, or white shirts in boardrooms tell the public what is safe to eat or take, even if it harms them. Evil at its most effective is not loud or bloody. It's quiet, clean, and orderly. No army needed if the population trusts the robe. No rebellion if the suffering is reframed as progress. No guilt if it's for your health, for your salvation, or for science. I mean, think about it. They got people turning over their loved ones for science, right? You can take Uncle Fred's body for science. We want to help everybody. See how it's all reverted, right? Now people are offering up their own bodies for science, and what are they doing with those bodies? Well, I can't even get started on that because if you offer your body to science, 100% they're making a ton of money off that body, and I got to keep moving here. So anyway, so no guilt if it's for your health, for your salvation, or for science. And of course, in 19th and 20th century, psychiatry developed alongside industrialization, diagnosing people who didn't conform to social norms. In the 1800s, some doctors diagnosed enslaved Africans who ran away as having a mental disorder. There was a word for it, was called drapetomania. In the USSR, dissidents were labeled mentally ill and locked in psychiatric hospitals. Full disclosure, I spent 2 nights in a U.S. psychiatric hospital. I got totally tricked into it, and I had no choice, right? And I also got locked up in a U.S. County jail. Here again, bad advice from a lousy attorney, but what do you do, right? You spend the night in jail and you move on. So yeah, that is exactly how it works. I went to a therapist because I had a big decision to make about whether I should sue Intel. The next thing I walk out, he's telling me to go get some pills, and I'd never been a pill person in my life. So yeah, it's exactly how the flow happens, right? So there are legitimate cases of severe paranoia, of course, but when the diagnostic manual, the DSM, classifies persistent fear of government surveillance as a symptom of mental illness, it certainly blurs the line, right? When they came up with that schizophrenia thing. So it actually classifies persistent fear of government surveillance as a symptom of mental illness. That's what they call schizophrenics. If you question priests, you're called immoral or blasphemous. If you question doctors, you're called anti-science or dangerous, or in my case, people call me actually insane for questioning doctors. Here I am, completely disabled from doctors themselves, and people call me the insane one, right? And that's kind of the whole humorous thing in all this, right? When I first started trying to talk to people about my fears of doctors, they were saying, I think that's kind of a paranoid decision to make. I don't think it's paranoid. But yeah, that's exactly what I got. Psychiatrists also use a white coat. The psychiatrist's office is designed to feel clinical and neutral, but it's really about a courtroom. They can diagnose you, put a label on you, and recommend drugs or confinement. Their judgment can overrule your testimony about your own mind. This is ultimate authority, power over your reality. Because before the scientific revolution, physicians were a tiny elite class trained in Galen's theories. Most people use herbalists, midwives, or local healers. The barber surgeons, they did bloodletting, amputations, and wound care, but were considered low-status tradesmen. The public perception at the time was doctors were often mistrusted, mocked in literature. During the same era that science was being institutionalized, 1600s and 1700s, doctors were also rising in prestige and becoming part of the same new order of authority. Fascinating how this happened, right? That's why I love doing root therapy, because unless we figure out how this stuff got started, it's almost impossible to wrap your brain around it, right? In fact, medicine and early science were so intertwined that they often shared the same people, patrons, and institutions. This was a major turning point. Doctors went from being distrusted barbers and folk healers to becoming pillars of respectable society. The doctor's visit became the secular confession, and the doctor became a licensed interpreter of truth about your body, just as the priest became the interpreter of truth about your soul. So basically, 1660s, Royal Society, Scientific Revolution, rebuilding of London. 1700s to 1800s, doctors and scientists rise together as a new priesthood. Then, of course, we had the printing press and the Bible. Instead of liberating everyone, these were harnessed to broadcast approved tricks and truths, whether from Protestant kings or Catholic popes. And that is exactly why white garments became the symbol of clarity, right? The genius of the white coat trick. So I think it was one of their better tricks, right? So, yeah, because children grew up reading and memorizing what elites wanted them to know, not what their grandparents told them orally once they got those printing presses going, right? And this was the part of time that it all started. I think this is where it all got going. Those Habsburgs, they ruled Austria, Spain, and later the Holy Roman Empire. That right there is our group of gypsies, okay? They were famous for dynastic marriages. The Habsburgs were deeply tied to the Jesuits. Jesuits ran their court of education, confessed their monarchs, and advised on imperial policy. Because Emperor Ferdinand II was a devout Jesuit pupil, and he unleashed the 30 Years' War. The Habsburgs repeatedly relied on court Jews for finance and wealth, which I think is very, very true, because they needed these Jews to keep their money together for them. Because I don't get the idea these Habsburgs and Khazars and all of them were all that good at that, because well, they're pretty brutal, right? So let's look at some of these universities after they got exposed for the slavery thing. Universities today often follow a similar pattern. They only acknowledge their ties to slavery or exploitation once somebody brings it to light. Georgetown publicly admitted it had sold enslaved people in the 1830s only after historians published the archival records. Harvard, Yale, Brown, and Princeton have all issued reports or built memorials once outside scrutiny made silence impossible. Limited reparation. Some offer scholarships, memorial plaques, or small programs, but critics argue they're not going far enough. So yes, in Georgetown alone, in 1838, Georgetown sold 272 enslaved men, women, and children to pay off debts. While the sale was known in historical records, the official public reckoning, okay, this started in 1838, right? The official public reckoning came in 2016 when the New York Times published a detailed expose based on archival research. This led Georgetown to apologize formally and announce measures like preferential admissions for descendants. Harvard University, in 2016, President Drew Faust hosted a conference on universities and slavery, marking Harvard's first institutional acknowledgement in 2016. In 2022, Harvard released a major 134-page detailing its ties to slavery, followed by a pledge of $100 million for reparation initiatives. So Brown University, 2003, they came clean. 2008, they came out with a report. Yale University, they came out with a thing in 2001 titled Yale, Slavery and Abolition. And it took them until 2016 to 17. They renamed some group for some black guy. Princeton. Princeton has been slower. In 2017, the Princeton of Slavery Project, they started that. The university then incorporated these findings into public discussions and exhibitions. So, Brown University led the official commission in 2003 to 2000, and it's been going on since the 1800s, okay? Yale acknowledged in 2001, but more forcibly acted in 2016 to 17. So they always they'll throw out a key little, maybe a tiny apology. And if nobody kicks back, they'll keep moving, right? But if they kick back, well, it took 16 years, but they finally did something, right? So Georgetown's reckoning burst into public view in 2016, tied to a 1838 sale. Harvard waited until 2016 for symbolic acknowledgement and 2022 for a full report. So yeah, let's take a look at what kind of students go to these colleges. Well, I'm not going to go through them all because I need to keep moving, but I've got all the facts down below because black students hover between 10 and 15. I just took a look at Harvard, and they between 10 and 15% in recent classes, 18% identified as African American. But there's this whole thing about they have tons of Chinese kids. Harvard is 35% white, 24% Asian. Same thing at Penn. So they're getting a lot of Chinese people who are paying full ticket to come over to these universities. But anyway, India and China together make up for 54% of all international students in the U.S., with South Korea next to among the top centers. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, so yeah, that ties the slavery thing from those Khazars directly to our own universities, right? So anyways, what it means is that universities are among the largest recipients of public funds outside of defense and healthcare. And they make massive endowments. And here again, I have that all down below. I'm not going to run through every bit of it, but I hope you'll take an interest and take a look for yourself, because Harvard is sitting on $50 billion. Yale has $40 billion. Stanford has $40 billion. Princeton has $35 billion. They have endowments larger than the GDP of some countries. So the returns on these funds often dwarf the money they collect in tuition. So that's why I say they're really because remember, universities are tax exempt, meaning their vast wealth compounds without the obligation that ordinary financial institutions face. So, yeah, while they hoard capital, they often charge students record tuition, funded by loans that enrich commercial banks. Students graduate burdened with debt, while universities get paid twice, once from tuition and again from investments made from their endowment wealth. So the bank-like feature isn't new. It's a modern extension of how universities originally grew their wealth. So then they were built and funded by slavery, plantations, and colonial trade. Now they're sustained by financial speculation, labor exploitation with their grad students and service staff not getting paid well, and tuition debt. So, yeah, and they're the ones who shape all the funding. Billions in taxpayer dollars flow into universities each year through federal grants, subsidies, and contracts. In theory, this should enrich education for the next generation, but in practice, a large share of the funding goes to military, intelligence, and pharmaceutical research rather than improving classrooms, reducing tuition, or expanding access. Much of the research subsidized by taxpayers is later privatized by corporations, meaning the public pays for innovation but does not share in the profits. While large universities sit on giant endowments and taxpayer-backed subsidies, students are pushed into lifelong debt cycles, making higher education one of the most predatory industries masquerading as public good. And I've got a whole list of things that I've talked about in the past, but I put them together for you today. The brutal experiments in the name of science. The darker side is that universities have frequently collaborated in experiments that exploited vulnerable people, often with government backing. There was a Tunxi syphilis study, and that went on for so long, 1932 to 1972. It was conducted by U.S. Public Health Service with university support, withholding treatment from black men to study disease progression. Then we had the MK Ultra 1950s to 70s. CIA mind control experiments were run out of university labs, dosing unwitting subjects with LSD and other drugs. Then, of course, we had the universities participated in tests where radioactive substances were given to patients without informed consent. And that was part of the Cold War human radiation experiments. They had the psychological and prison studies. Stanford's prison experiment and similar studies revealed how universities often blur the line between research and abuse. Universities justify this by claiming to serve the advancement of knowledge or national security, but the pattern is very clear. Taxpayer money flows in. Universities and their researchers conduct projects aligned with state and corporate interests, and ordinary people, students, patients, prisoners, marginalized communities bear the risks while universities and corporations pocket the benefits. Because Silicon Valley, Stanford served as a launchpad for military and government-funded research. Federal money during the Cold War, especially through DARPA and the DoD, fueled electronics and computing revolution. Google, its core search algorithm, was originally funded by National Science Foundation. What began as a publicly financed research project became a trillion-dollar private corporation. Oracle emerged from a CIA-funded project codenamed Oracle that relied on federal contracts and taxpayer funding before becoming a private software giant. Biotech and pharma, university labs funded with public grants routinely patent discoveries and license them to pharmaceutical companies, which then sell drugs back to the public at inflated prices. It's really just a shell game. Taxpayers fund the research. Universities and faculty develop discoveries. Instead of remaining public goods, discoveries are patented, spun off into startups, or licensed to corporations. The public pays again through tuition, software subscription, or inflated drug prices. This isn't accidental, it's structural. Universities funnel public money into private profit pipelines while presenting themselves as neutral educational institutions. The result is starved education, burdened students, and billionaires enriched by public-funded discoveries. So I'm going to leave this one alone, but it's all down below. The way the U.S. government has been tricking students into all these loans and stuff is just off the charts, but I can't get into it today because the U.S. government itself is a primary lender profiting the interest while pretending to help, and they actually target the poor, the unemployed, even the homeless, promising job security after graduation. They get non-dischargeable debt. Unlike credit cards or mortgages, student loans are nearly impossible to erase, even in bankruptcy. For-profit colleges preyed on undereducated or desperate populations. Many collapse, leaving students with worthless degrees but permanent debt. The promise is that debt buys opportunity, but many graduates remain underemployed while balances grow due to interest. Only in America has student debt ballooned into a $1.7 trillion market, larger than the subprime mortgage bubble before 2008. Are you following this? The students are being burdened with more debt than all have happened during 2008. $1.7 trillion. That is what these kids are getting put in front of them, and their brains are not even really able to function, and they know this. What happens is I could walk in, if I was a 20-year-old student, I could walk into some place and I could sign a piece of paper for $40,000, $100,000, or whatever, because that loan became guaranteed by the U.S. government. A total 100% engineered scam. And the scam was to take the rest of us down, right? So among this debt as a path to slavery is what I'm going to be talking about now. The Slavic tribes connected to the Khazars, people who couldn't repay debts could be forced into servitude. That's where the whole debt thing came from. The Khazars acted as middlemen, taxing and regulating this system. Individuals in debt could be sold into slavery and exported south into Byzantine or Islamic markets. They're the ones that cooked up this whole slave thing, right? And it models exactly, almost to a T, what's going on now. Now keep in mind, this is my opinion. I provided you with everything that I went through to come to this opinion, and clearly I can't read every single page that I looked at to come to this conclusion, but I've given you all of my notes, all of them. So hopefully you'll start to draw some conclusions of your own. I'm not saying, hey, trust me, you got to agree with me. I have nothing in that. I've never used those words. So the Khazars acted as middlemen, taxing people, right? In Jewish law, which some Khazar elites adopted, debt bondage was recognized, though with time limits. So debt slavery was also legally, so Khazars could convert debtors into tradable commodities across legal systems. And they're doing the same thing now. We really are a product of these people, right? They would be nothing without our product. So I would hope people would consider stopping giving them your product. Don't commit to anything that they're asking you to do. If you want to zoom around and look at what they're saying, zoom around, but don't give them all of your watch time. Don't sit through their ads. Don't do what they're telling you to do. So I'm going to need to take a break right here. I'm hoping that I will get through this show today. So hang on there. Okay, let's get to this business of, I did a sound check, and I still sound fuzzy on my end. I don't know if it's this cheap speaker that I have or if something is truly wrong with my recording device, but I don't know. Nothing I can do about it right this second, so I'll keep going. So anyway, let's talk about Israel and not having a constitution. People often ask, why doesn't Israel have a constitution like other democracies? Well, they claim wartime urgency. In 1948, Israel declared independence in the middle of a war. Leaders had to run a country while fighting for its survival. They needed a functional government immediately. Cabinet, army, courts, taxes. Writing a grand constitution would have taken time they didn't have. Much too busy for all this garbage, right? From the beginning, Israelis argued about identity. How Jewish should the state be? How democratic? What role should religion play in marriage, schools, and public life? No one could agree, so they postponed the fight. Israel was and still is diverse, secular and religious Jews, immigrants from Europe and the Middle East, plus a large Arab minority. Governments depended on fragile coalitions. A constitution that took sides on religion or minority could have collapsed the system. In 1948, no one knew how much territory Israel could control. Locking borders into a constitution would have tied the state's hands before wars and negotiations played out. Well, they had a lot of problems, didn't they? In the 1950s, Israel's parliament, which is called the Knesset, adopted a compromise. Instead of one document, they'd write basic laws, chapter by chapter. Over time, courts treated these laws as constitutional. But because they can be changed by a simple majority, they remain fragile. Always a trick, right? In short, war, identity disputes, political diversity, and border uncertainty all pointed to the same solution. Keep things open. Keep things flexible. This choice about law mirrors Israel's choice about borders. Both remain unfinished by design. So what other countries without a single entrenched written constitution? These systems rely on basic organic laws plus conventions or on a supreme religious text instead of one document. Okay, the United Kingdom, uncodified constitution based on statutes. No single text. Parliament is sovereign. New Zealand, uncodified, relies on the Constitution Act 1986, the Treaty of Wangtang, key statutes and conventions. Israel, they operate under basic laws since 1950. They function constitutionally, but there's no single entrenched document. Many basic laws can be changed by simple majorities. Saudi Arabia, treaties like the Quran, Saudi Arabia treats the Quran and the Sunnah as the ultimate constitutional authority. The 1992 Basic Law organizes a state, but it isn't a Western-style constitution. So, there's a few more. There's place in Somalia uses a provincial constitution as of 2012. Libya, Sudan, South Sudan, Nepal, pre-2015. There were periods governed by interim or traditional charters before a new constitution. People over time have gone without borders or constitutions, right? So, but almost all modern states have some disputes, but a handful have big, persistent ones that shape strategy and diplomacy. Israel declared independence in 1948 without any fixed borders. The 1949 armistice lines explicitly not borders. Post-1967 status of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and Golan remains contested. India and Pakistan, the line in Kashmir, is a ceasefire line. Sovereignty is disputed. Morocco, West Sahara. Morocco control claims most of the territory, but the final status is still unresolved. And pay attention to this particular land dispute, because this particular border dispute has raked them in a ton of money. Russia and Ukraine. Borders internationally recognized pre-2014. And further annexations in 2022 are widely unrecognized, leaving sovereignty contested. Since Russia's first scale invasion in February 2022, perk up your ears on this one, the U.S. Congress has appropriated over $170 billion to Ukraine for military, humanitarian, economic, and reconstruction. Or, to put it more directly, they have sent $170 billion to their friends in the Khazarian mafia right over there in Ukraine. And according to tracking, since the full-scale invasion, Western allies have committed more than 287. So the U.S. has popped off with more of the money. So, Washington and Brussels, good morning, Brussels, have together committed nearly $500 billion to Ukraine since 2022. Gee, does it make you suspicious about why Ukraine? I mean, just because Ukraine was once Khazaria, I mean, this shouldn't make anybody suspicious now, should it? So, $500 billion to Ukraine since 2022. Large parts of their own populations live in poverty. In the U.S., tens of thousands of people sleep under bridges, in tents, or in cars every night. Major cities face spiraling housing costs, drug crisis, and crumbling infrastructures. On any given night in 2023, more than 650,000 Americans were homeless, the highest number recorded since federal tracking began. Shelters overflow while encampments grow under overpasses and highways. Millions face eviction, food insecurity, and medical debt. Yet social programs are chronically underfunded compared to defense and foreign aid. Leaders insist Ukraine aid is about defending democracy, but the optics are stark. Billions can be found for missiles and subsidies abroad, while citizens at home sleep on sidewalks. Why does this feel like betrayal? Well, it suggests government, or the Khazarians, or the psychopaths, whatever you want to call them, the parasites, whatever you want to call these people, right? It suggests governments are more responsive to geopolitical strategies than to the suffering of their own citizens. Aid abroad is rushed through with weak oversight, while aid at home comes with layers of red tape and means testing. Citizens are told there is no money for universal health care, affordable housing, or student debt relief, yet in emergencies abroad, vast sums appear overnight. There's an irony in the geography of today's massive aid flows. Many of the most famous immigrant entrepreneurs in the United States, Sergey Brin, Google, born in Moscow, Jan Korn from WhatsApp and PayPal, born in Kyiv, Max Lesathan from PayPal, also born in Kyiv, among others, trace their origins back to Eastern Europe. Their families supposedly fled persecution, poverty, or instability in the old Russian and Ukraine territories and built fortunes in America. Now, billions in Western taxpayer dollars are flowing back to the very same region their families once left behind. Anybody else as suspicious as I am, or am I just the most paranoid person walking? But critics note that the territory receiving this money overlaps with the ancestral homelands of many dysphoric elites who remain deeply networked in finance, technology, and politics. It gives the appearance of a closed loop. Eastern Europe families fled to the U.S. in the 20th century, often joining intellectual and business elites. Some became founders of globally dominant corporations, consolidating extraordinary influence in American business and politics. In the 21st century, vast sums of taxpayer money are redirected to Ukraine and neighboring territories, raising suspicion that the aid serves private networks as much as public goals. Whether or not that money is literally going home to individual elites, the optics are troubling. A region with historic ties to powerful dysphorias now receives unprecedented streams of cash, while basic needs in donor countries go unmet. So yeah, this was all because of the land dispute. And you can't tell me they didn't cook up this land dispute? Well, of course they did. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Ukraine's borders were internationally recognized, but parts of them, especially Crimea, Donbass, and areas with large Russian-speaking populations, were politically sensitive. Moscow always viewed them as within its sphere of influence. So in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea after Ukraine's Euro-Maidan revolution, breaking international law. The U.S. and Europe imposed sanctions, but aid flows to Ukraine were modest then in 2014. However, the full invasion in 2022, Russia expanded the conflict, betting that weak or disputed borders would give it leverage. That invasion triggered a flood of Western support, military, financial, humanitarian, on a scale not seen in decades. Because Ukraine's sovereignty was contested, Russia saw an opportunity. That action didn't just destabilize Ukraine, it threatened the entire European order. NATO and EU, fearing a wider collapse of border security norms, threw in their support. Well, of course there were. There was some blood there, right, NATO? You love that blood and gore. All this sacrifice, all these people getting blown up, the buildings shredded to bits. That must be part of your nightmares and your dreams, right? The U.S. led with tens of billions, but Europe matched with even larger combined commitments. And where is this irony here? Well, a dispute over borders that Russia judged as weak has instead triggered the largest transfer of public money into Ukraine in modern history. Taxpayers across the West now carry the cost. So this creates the paradox that I've been circling. Ukraine's unresolved borders, once seen as a local weakness, became the mechanism by which global taxpayers were drawn into underwriting the conflict. So, yeah, a lot of money, right? This was the largest package of foreign aid to a single country in such a short time frame since World War II because of those borders, right? Well, Israel, of course, has not. Well, Israel gets paid $3 to $4 billion, just to be fair, but it pales in comparison to Ukraine. But you know, Bibi Netanyahu and all those people that are running Israel, they also came from Eastern Europe, so they're still winning the money, right? And because after World War II, South Korea received large aid flows after the Korean War, but mostly in the 50s and 60s. Iraq and Afghanistan received enormous U.S. spending during military occupation, but that was tied to U.S. wars, not to those own countries' contested borders. Ukraine is unique because it is not occupied by U.S. or NATO forces, yet it has drawn aid on the level of a full-scale occupation or rebuilding project. So many powerful tech and financial elites in the U.S. and Europe trace their roots back to Eastern Europe. Even without direct evidence of diversion, the perception that money is going home is strong to me. Now, I don't know if anybody else feels this way. I don't know. I don't have any way of figuring that out. I can just tell you what I think happened and what I see as a big rat in this picture, right? Because here again, Congress has struggled to enforce strong tracking, and Inspector General have flagged major gaps. Billions flow quickly with only partial accounting. To ordinary taxpayers, especially when homelessness and poverty persist at home, the combination of weak oversight and the ancestral connections with unprecedented aid looks like fuel in Richie the insiders. My opinion. I came up to this conclusion. You can come up to your own conclusion. Other countries have received aid during war or crisis, but no modern case matches Ukraine in both speed and sheer volume of transfer for a border conflict. That is why the flow of money looks extraordinary. So, anyway, so yeah, there were proposals for stronger oversight, but no. Everything had to be done in a rush, right? Because this was just, in my mind, they were sending the money, tax money from Europe and from the United States into Ukraine. Well, how would anybody know where it went, right? There were no trackings put on it. Nobody had to do. So let's take a look at how does Israel compare to all this business. Well, Israel, the way they have their system rigged, it makes their basic laws more malleable, more than most constitution texts. I personally believe this was all on purpose, but here again, think for yourself. So, because Israel didn't do a constitution, they came up with these basic laws, and the laws are more malleable. Well, sounds like a plot to me. So many states have disputes, but Israel stands out because it entered statehood without declared borders, embedding that ambiguity into the 1949 armistice text, and then built decades of policy, settlements, annexation laws, and facts on the ground on top of that open-ended foundation. So very few modern countries pair no extended constitution with no agreed final borders over such a long period. That combination is what makes Israel's case distinctive in the last 100 to 200 years. So yeah, I gave you the ones that didn't have a constitution: UK, New Zealand, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. But Israel is unique because of those two areas, the border and that constitution. So yeah, and I've got them all listed down below, all these other border disputes. There have been quite a few of them. There was Armenian, Azerbaijan, China, India, Cyprus. Yeah, people have had border disputes, but nobody fixes the same criteria as Israel. So, and also the malleable laws, right? Because when they declared their independence, May the 14th, 1949, they did not define the borders of the new state for all those reasons. Oh, we're just too busy. Yeah, well, and they wanted room to negotiate. The reason here's what I think the real reason is this. If you don't define your borders, okay, then that's why they're always going into all the other countries. And if you look at that new Israel plan called the Greater Israel or something like that, their plan right there in writing states they plan to roll into all of those other countries, right? So they can do all this because they started without defined borders. And that's where all of this trauma to all their neighbors started, because their neighbors have been vulnerable. Every war, 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973, has seen shifts in who controls what land. The lack of a final legal border means international law treaties treats these areas, Okay, I'm having some trouble staying online, so we'll have to see how this goes today. So anyway, as far as these borders, so without fixed borders, Israel has been able to secure territory it considers strategically necessary. But this has also kept the conflict in a permanent state of negotiation and instability, because Palestinians and Arab states view this as an open-ended project of territorial expansion, which exactly is how it looks like to me also. They just want to be able to grab as much as they can. I would have to say, so if this was all pre-planned, so why would you want to have no borders? For most countries, borders are a legal and diplomatic constraint. They define what land is yours, what counts as crossing into someone else's territory, when the international community can condemn if you go beyond it. Well, yeah, not in this case, though, right? Israel's founders intentionally avoided that box by leaving borders open-ended. Any gains in war could later be argued as part of the future negotiated borders. Israel could avoid being labeled as an aggressor state for simply existing beyond the 1947 plan, because nothing final has ever been agreed. It forced other parties, Arabs, UN, US, to accept a moving reality on the ground before there could even be a peace deal. So yeah, I see it as a complete trick, and what that did, it locks in the neighbors, not Israel. Countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan have internationally recognized borders. If they cross them, they are immediately condemned as aggressors. Israel, by contrast, can operate beyond its de facto lines. They had airstrikes in Syria, raids in Gaza, incursions into Lebanon, while arguing that it is acting in self-defense. The exact line of sovereignty is still subject to dispute. The U.S. and other allies often back Israel's position that borders should be determined through direct negotiations, not imposed from outside, which means Israel holds the strongest hand as long as negotiations are frozen. Pressure to withdraw is weaker because there is no agreed legal starting line to return to. And why is it so rare? Well, most new states are required to define borders when they seek recognition. Israel was a rare exception because the Holocaust had just happened, so there was immense sympathy. Yeah, flashing that Jew card, right? The UN partition plan gave the legal basis for statehood, even if the borders were rejected by the Arab side. Sounds like kind of like a setup to me. The U.S. and USSR both recognized Israel within minutes, despite the ambiguity, a diplomatic windfall. So borderless became a geopolitical weapon, and it's one of the reasons Israel has been able to reshape the map repeatedly over 75 years while staying inside the international system. So let me read this piece. It says, Israel has no written constitution. That's not a joke. Anyone who bothers to browse the official website of the Knesset, which is the Israel parliament, would see that ever since its creation in 1948 until now, that's 74 years, or maybe a few more now, there has never been any constitution for Israel. Instead, it's operating based on a bunch of basic laws that it developed in place of the Constitution, which is the natural requirement of any normal country. But why doesn't Israel come up with a constitution? Why didn't its founding fathers, and the generations after them just sit down and write a constitution? Surely that important matter didn't simply slip out of their minds. Here are a few main reasons that made it impossible for the Israelis to write a constitution. They do not want fixed borders. In case there is a constitution, there must be borders for the state, and they don't want that. They want a borderless state, or with temporary borders that is expandable at any time when they can conquer more Arab lands. And that is what historically happened. In 1947, the United Nations issued its Palestine Partition Plan, Resolution 181, which granted 56% of historical Palestine to the proposed Jewish state. The Jewish Agency immediately accepted the resolution, which was extremely unfair to Arabs, only to obtain legitimacy for its new state and not a sincere acceptance of the borders as set by the plan. The next year, in 1948, Israel conquered 78% of Palestine by war, which is 40% more than what it was allocated to it by the UN. In 1967, Israel expanded further and conquered by war 100% of Palestine, now still holding to it and refusing to withdraw. Also, in 1967, Israel took over the Golan Heights from Syria and annexed it, and the Sinai from Egypt, eventually returned it after the Camp David retreat. In 1982, Israel occupied the southern part of Lebanon and kept it until the year 2000, when it was defeated by the Lebanese resistance movement and thus forced it to withdraw. Israel wants to keep it that way, no fixed borders. This touches its biblical Thoracic dreams about the land of Israel that extends as far as Iraq to the east to the Nile in the west. A constitution cannot allow that. Excuse me. In 1948, the vast majority of land of what became the state of Israel actually belonged to the Palestinian Arabs, who were forcefully replaced to neighboring Arab countries. Israel illegally seized their land and properties. A constitution would create a problem for the usurpers who have no legal basis for owning the land they conquered by war. Israel confiscated the Palestinians' land, and obviously no modern constitution would have allowed for it. Well, who is a citizen? This is a basic question that cannot be overlooked by any constitution, and it created a big problem for the Zionists who were behind the State of Israel project. In the Zionist ideology, Israel is the homeland of the Jews all over the world. So every Jew, or with or without his or her consent, is a natural candidate for citizenship. But how can anyone put that in a constitution? You can't just say, for example, that the Dutch Jews are citizens of Israel, because they aren't. At the same time, the Zionists couldn't abide by the natural definition of citizenship in all modern states in the world, that the citizens of a state are its residents who live in it, because this would cut the link between Israel and the Jews of the world, who could not be automatically privileged with the Israeli citizenship in that case. A dilemma for which the Zionists found no solution. So where's their basic of jurisdiction? Is it in the Torah? Since the idea of Zionism itself, on which the whole Israel project was founded, was based on religious Jewish appeal, the chosen people, children of Israel, returning to the promised land, it was impossible for the founders to settle on a secular, modern, and Western-style constitution. The Orthodox Jews, who believe the Torah must be the basis of the Jewish state, could not be ignored. And let's not forget that even the secular Jews then, who mainly came from Europe, were not united in their view of the matter. Actually, they were divided between the liberal democratic side and the socialist communist side. Not writing a constitution at all was then the best option for the Zionist leadership. Discrimination laws against the Arab Palestinians. There are many laws, regulations, and practices in Israel that discriminate against Arabs as an ethnic and religious minority. Just one example of that, in 1988, Zachary Lockman, a Harvard history professor, wrote at the New York Times that some 92% of Israel's land is administered in accordance with regulations which prohibit these lands from being purchased, leased, or worked by Arab citizens of Israel. Obviously, discrimination and racism cannot be written in any constitution, so the Zionists had to choose between granting equal rights to the Arabs and losing the Jewish privilege and not having a constitution. Israel has never been a normal state. The absence of a constitution is evidence of that fact. The world has to be aware of that and must exert pressure on this state. Well, I don't know about that. But anyway, so instead of a basic single constitution, they have those laws. The Supreme Court then interprets those basic laws as quasi-constitutional, but they can be amended or repeated by a simple majority in the cassette, unlike entrenched constitutions that require supermajorities. Attempts to draft a full constitution have failed due to disagreements over the role of religion in the state, civil versus religious law, the status of Palestinians and minorities, and final borders. So yeah, like I said before, the only other place that don't have a constitution are the UK, New Zealand, and Saudi Arabia. But Israel is unique because it does not have other. So that's what the story is about that. I'm going to take a break here and play this clip, and I'll be back on the other side with much more information. So here we go.
Between 1917 and 1948, Britain controlled the area of the Middle East then known as Palestine. This chapter of history was to have a profound effect on both Arabs and Jews. Yet most British people know little about it. This film is a simple outline of a very complex story. So what took Britain to Palestine in the first place? For centuries, the region had been ruled by the Ottoman Turks. But when the First World War broke out in 1914, the Turks allied with Britain's enemies, Germany, and the other Central Powers. Palestine and the Middle East were regarded as highly strategic to the British Empire because of oil, and also because the Suez Canal controlled the sea route to India. The Middle East was now under the control of Britain's enemies, so Britain considered it vital to defeat the Turks and gain control for the Allies. In 1917, General Allenby and his troops advanced across southern Palestine, and in December they captured Jerusalem. By the following year, all of Palestine had come under British claim to an end. Britain and France issued a proclamation promising that former subjects of the Ottoman Empire would be able to determine their own futures. Briefly, freedom was in the air. However, a different reality lay behind the words. Long before the end of the war, the Allies had been planning who would control the Ottoman Empire when the Turks were defeated. These conflicting plans are often referred to as the contradictory promises. Firstly, in October 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, British High Commissioner in Egypt, had promised the Arabs in the person of Sharif Hussein of Mecca that they could have an independent Arab state after the war if they would rise up against their overlords, the Turks. Believing that they were fighting for their freedom, some Arabs joined the Allied war effort and, assisted by Lawrence of Arabia, helped the Allies drive the Turks from their lands. However, for the last 100 years there has been controversy over how McMahon's letter to Hussein should be interpreted. Did he implicitly include Palestine in the proposed independent Arab state, or did he not? Many Arabs and senior British figures have consistently maintained that Palestine was included, while British governments since 1920 have argued that it was excluded. But meanwhile, Britain had become party to two further wartime agreements, both of which seemed to contradict the undertaking to Hussein. In 1916, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France allocated what is now Syria and Lebanon to France, and what is now Jordan and Iraq to Britain, whilst proposing to keep Palestine under international control. Then, a year later, Britain made yet another undertaking concerning Palestine. In November 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the Jewish community. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This promise became known as the Balfour Declaration. The idea that the Jewish people should be restored to the Holy Land, so that biblical prophecies could be fulfilled, had been promoted by some Christians since the 1600s. Then, from the 1890s, the idea of Zionism began to take hold amongst some Jews, as Theodor Herzl argued that the Jewish people needed a political homeland of their own if they were to escape the horrific anti-Semitic persecution that was rife, particularly in Russia and Central Europe. By the early 1900s, Herzl's successor, Chaim Weizmann, saw Britain as the power with the global influence to make the Zionist goal a reality. So he set out to convince leading politicians that the Jewish people needed a homeland in Palestine, where they had deep spiritual and historical bonds. The Balfour Declaration was the result. Why did the War Cabinet respond to Zionist pressure in this way? Foreign Secretary Balfour was one of the highly placed Christians in British society who believed that the Jewish people should be restored to the Holy Land. Prime Minister Lloyd George, who also came from a restorationist background, dreamt of putting Israel back on the map. Yet, at the same time, there were strategic calculations for issuing the Balfour Declaration. At this desperate point in the European conflict, the War Cabinet hoped that the promise of a Jewish homeland would win the Allies the sympathies of Jews and their supporters worldwide. However, the British government did not consult the people then living in Palestine about its plans to create a Jewish homeland there. 90% of the population of Palestine were Arabs, who lived together with a small Jewish community. Palestine had been predominantly Arab in culture and language for many centuries. Yet, in private, Balfour wrote, "In Palestine, we do not propose even to go to the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants." The major powers were now committed to Zionism, which he described as being of far profounder import than the desires of the Arab inhabitants. The Balfour Declaration simply stated that the civil and religious came to an end. How would all these complex undertakings work out in practice? As the Western powers met in Paris to negotiate the peace settlement, Sharif Hussein sent his son Faisal to make sure Britain's promise of independence for the Arabs was not forgotten. But instead, the newly formed League of Nations handed control of Palestine to Britain. Under the terms of the League of Nations' mandate for Palestine, Britain was required to implement the Balfour Declaration by supporting the creation of a Jewish national home, and at the same time, to prepare the people of Palestine for eventual self-government. The League of Nations stated that mandatory powers held a sacred trust to ensure the well-being and development of people in their care. What happened to the other areas that Sharif Hussein anticipated would gain independence? Transjordan, now Jordan, was made an autonomous emirate under Hussein's son, Abdullah. In the same way, the new kingdom of Iraq was given to his brother, Faisal. These were the rewards Hussein received for his loyalty to the British war effort, but they did not include Syria or Palestine. Angry Arab crowds soon massed in Jerusalem, denouncing the Balfour Declaration and demanding the self-determination that had been promised by Britain and France in 1918. Having made conflicting promises, Britain now had to face up to their consequences. She had created a contradiction. Just how unworkable this situation was, it took her 30 years to accept. Both communities, Jews and Arabs, believed they had been promised the land. As the Zionists swiftly began to implement their objectives, the Arabs were the first to conclude they had been deceived. Riots broke out in 1920. In 1921, there was even greater violence as Arabs attacked Jews and the British tried to regain order. After a period of relative calm, mutual suspicion between the Arab and Jewish communities flared up again in 1929 and rapidly escalated into mob violence with horrific consequences. 133 Jews and 116 Arabs were killed. Britain's response was slow and inadequate. Calm was finally restored by a show of British force. Meanwhile, the Jewish community was forging ahead under the umbrella of the British Mandate, securing major economic concessions and establishing its own elected assembly and institutions of government. The Arab majority, on the other hand, felt left behind economically and politically. To be granted democratic representation, they were effectively required to accept the Balfour Declaration. But the Arabs rejected this, fearing that a Jewish national home would lead to the creation of a Jewish state in their land. For their part, the British feared that an elected Arab majority would oppose Jewish demands for land and immigration. And so they held back the democratic progress they were supposed to foster under the Mandate. Britain was upholding the first part of the Declaration, to establish a home for the Jewish people. But the second undertaking in the Declaration, to protect the rights of the Arab population, proved to be hollow. Arab alarm grew still further in the 1930s, when increasing numbers of Jews sought sanctuary in Palestine as the spectre of anti-Semitism grew in Nazi Germany. As more and more land passed into Jewish hands, the sense of Arab dispossession grew. By May 1936, Palestine was in open rebellion, and it was not just Jewish communities who were being attacked, it was the British too. Increasingly losing control, the British authorities resorted to ruthless methods to put down the revolt, including hangings, house demolitions, and the use of civilians as human shields. For a period, British and Jewish men fought the Arabs jointly in a counter-insurgency force known as the Special Night Squads. By 1939, the rebellion was suppressed, leaving the Palestinian leadership weakened for years to come. To try to address the underlying deadlock between Arabs and Jews, London had responded with a succession of inquiries and commissions through the 1930s. Their dilemma was that any attempt to placate one community would provoke the anger of the other. At a loss for a solution, the Peel Commission of 1937 proposed to partition Jews and Arabs into two states. But Arab opinion led by the vehemently anti-Zionist Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, denounced any idea of conceding territory to Jews as unthinkable. However, as Europe slid towards war, the British government changed course. A government white paper of 1939 abandoned partition and proposed that in 10 years Palestine would become independent, representatively governed by Arabs and Jews. Controls were now put in place over how many Jews could immigrate to Palestine and how much land could pass into Jewish hands. For the first time, Arabs were to be given a say over Jewish immigration. The reason Neville Chamberlain's government swung in favor of Arab opinion at this point was the prospect of war. London feared that in a global conflict, the Arab world might turn against Britain, whilst the support of Jews would be guaranteed in view of their persecution by the Nazis. Jewish opinion immediately condemned the White Paper as an act of British betrayal and a retreat from the Balfour Declaration. There was fury that Jewish people would be restricted from finding sanctuary at their hour of greatest need. Nevertheless, Britain upheld the limits on Jewish immigration into Palestine right through the war. As refugees fleeing the Holocaust were arrested trying to enter Palestine, or were even sent back to Germany, as in the case of the Exodus, the Jewish community turned against Britain and the mandate. Sections of Jewish opinion became increasingly militant and violent, and Britain suffered heavy losses from terrorist atrocities. In February 1947, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin stated that Britain was referring responsibility for the Palestinian problem to the United Nations. How should British people today respond to the story of Britain in Palestine?
Okay, let's wrap up some of these comments. Ben-Gurion, in his own words, he explicitly wrote about using war outcomes to expand the state beyond the 1947 partition plan. Early Zionist debates, some leaders openly opposed locking in borders before seeing how much land could realistically be secured. Israel's first foreign minister, Moshe Sharad, understood that leaving borders undefined would keep the question on the table for future negotiation. Yeah, quite a big trick, right? Quite a big, evil trick, if you ask me. So, what else do we have for today? Why does this feel buried? Well, to say openly that Israel was designed as an unfinished project with elastic borders invites accusations of questioning Israel's legitimacy. Western historians in the 50s to the 80s often wrote sympathetically about Israel as a democratic ally. Less emphasis was placed on its long-term strategic maneuvering. And of course, in the mainstream education, school books typically present Israel's borders as a problem caused by the Arab rejection of the partition plan. Yeah, when all else fails, blame the Arabs, right? Putting the burden outside of Israel rather than exploring Israel's choices. So basically, not many people are coming out and saying much about Israel these days. Social media is all abuzz with them. Did they kill that guy, Charlie Kirk? Well, I mean, the whole thing is pretty shaky, right? So anyway, so I have a lot more evidence that Ben-Gurion wrote a letter to his son. And the letters there, it often discussed among historians, indicating that Ben-Gurion saw petition as an interim solution with more land possible later. Yeah, they never move off of the greedy state now, do they? So yeah, I've got all their quotes down below. I'm very confident that this really happened, right? So yeah, it all happened because of that. And finally, in the 80s to the 90s, some new historians started to talk about that. But they reinsert Israel's decision-making And not only Arab rejection into the story, that's a move, right? Today, legal scholars, well, I don't know that people are saying much, so this is what happens when you have an oppressive government. People start running back to their corners, right? Let me see here. Yeah, I've got it all down below. This has all just been a big shift, right? And you got to remember, all of the people, not all of them, but most of the people telling the story about Israel, where did they come from? Well, they came from those universities, right? The universities that are helping the government and holding all that money and lying to us day after day after day. Yeah, that was it. So yeah, I see this as 100% a complete plot from the very beginning. So yeah, because that way they can just kind of like grab it all. And your neighbors are locked in, but you aren't. So anytime you go against your neighbors, well, you can put them in the corner because they have they have the restrictions on their side, right? So yeah, I got more than you ever want to know about down below. I have looked at it all. Israel has never been a normal state in more ways than one. Israel, in my opinion, is exactly an extension of the United States. They are just the people to protect that region. The United States wants all those borders taken down. Israel is just the proxy that's making all of this happen, right? So why does this look like deception? Well, they say we can't define our borders until we have peace. We can't have peace until we have secure borders. We can't pass a constitution until we know our borders. Circular logic all the way, right? So anyway, so yeah. So how historians usually frame it? Well, the Constitution, they say Israel has no constitution because of unresolved religious secular disputes, and they present it as a byproduct of internal division, not intentional statecraft, right? And they also say borders were left undefined because war prevented agreement, treating it as a circumstance, not a strategic choice. And of course, their tone. Academic works often avoid suggesting that leaders wanted ambiguity because that implies premeditation and long-term planning, which could be politically insensitive. So yeah, they say it in their own words. I've got it all listed for you over on my website. I'm not even a slightly bit confused over who said what, right? Because it's very, very well documented, and that is the bottom line. So let me close this off. I can't believe I made it to the end. So let me tell you this little story that kind of wraps this all up. Before I close this show, I want to tell you how out of control doctors and their advice is, and downright danger with this insane story about baby diapers. Yes, you heard me right, baby diapers. There is really a plot line for everything. I found this interesting clip that I watched. It was called Funded Science. Big diaper cashes in on delayed potty training. And for some reason I was motivated to click on it. Well, let me read you a couple of the comments. One person said, "Makes sense. My dog was potty trained within a few months. Why would a human need 3 years?" And what this is about, in order to sell more diapers, they started maneuvering through their scientists in saying that kids should not be potty trained so early, that people should wait, right? I mean, it is so insane, right? So they actually needed to sell diapers, so they convinced the entire public that they should be keeping their kids in diapers. And now they're extending the age. They're telling kids should be in diapers until they're like 3 years old. Another comment was, "My kid is 16 months old and is clearly ready. I had no idea I should start this young. Everyone always told me 3 to 5 years old to start this. If my cat can learn where he needs to do his business, I think a baby can too." Somebody else said, "I never would have thought a story about diapers would be as interesting as this was." Somebody else said, "It's shocking. the average American doesn't understand that the U.S. government and big U.S. corporations absolutely hate you. They hate your guts. Their sole purpose is to bleed you like a stuck pig of your time and money. Exactly my point, right? You give them your time, that's what they want, right? Don't give it to them. So let's talk about these diapers and this insane story. Now, I didn't just take this woman's word for it in this clip. I went out and I did my own research because this is sounding too crazy, right? Well, I believe the woman. It's not that I didn't think she was telling the truth for a second. I totally believed her, okay? So, in the early 1900s to the 1950s, doctors often encourage mothers to begin toilet training very early, sometimes before a child's first birthday. The focus was on discipline and habit forming. But in the 1960s to the 1970s, Dr. Benjamin Spock, with pediatric psychology influencing parenting, the emphasis moved forward. Child readiness rather than strict schedules. This pushed the typical start closer to 2 years. 1980s to 1990s, the American Academy of Pediatrics and child development experts promoted the idea that children develop readiness at their own pace. Most training was encouraged around 2 to 3 years. Then the 2000s to today, it gets really scary. Pediatricians in the U.S. generally say toilet training usually begins between 18 months and 3 years. But many children don't fully complete it until 3 to 5 years old, especially for staying dry at night. The American Academy of Pediatrics, or the AAP, explicitly warns against pushing too early, framing it as a developmental milestone that varies widely. So what's going on today? Well, most U.S. doctors tell parents this: for daytime control, it's often achieved between 2.5 and 3.5 years. They say that nighttime dryness might not be consistent until the ages of 4 to 5 years old. So then there was a paper that was written. They had too many diapers. The influential paper that reset U.S. advice was T. Barry Brazelton's. He wrote this piece called A Child-Oriented Approach to Toilet Training in Pediatrics, 1962. It recommended waiting for readiness, with first success around 27 to 28 months. Brazelton set the new late standard in 1962 at 27 to 28 months. Over time, with cultural reinforcement and corporate marketing, that slid further to 3 to 5 years later than his original findings. Historically, cloth diapers and limited access to disposables encouraged parents to start sooner. So in 1948 to 1961, the first commercial disposable diapers appeared in Sweden in 1948. And in the U.S., Pampers was launched in 1961. By the 1970s and 80s, disposables had become widespread in developed countries. They say they were more absorbent, convenient, and comfortable, meaning kids and parents no longer felt the urgency to train earlier. The shift in medical advice happened around the 1950s to the 1960s, with that Dr. Benjamin Spock and other child development experts began emphasizing child readiness rather than parental schedules. This lined up perfectly with the spread of disposables. Fewer leaks, less pressure on the parents. By the 1980s to 1990s, pediatric groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics said 2 to 3 years was normal. And now, in the 2000s until now, 3 to 5 years, right? So, before disposables, early training saved time, money, and laundry. After disposables, later training sold more diapers. The shift was reinforced by pediatric advice that coincidentally aligned with the interests of diaper companies, who also sponsored parent guides, magazines, and pediatric conferences. And here's where you need to pay attention. This is the part that is truly criminal. Thick, disposable diapers, especially overnight or the super absorbent ones, spread the hips unnaturally wide. Studies show this can affect how toddlers walk, making their gait wider and less stable compared to being diaper-free. Delayed motor skill. Cultures where babies spend more time without diapers, like in Africa or parts of Asia, often seen earlier walking and squatting milestones than heavily diapered Western children. Modern diapers contain gels, plastics, fragrances, and bleaching agents. Prolonged use increases exposure, especially on sensitive skin and reproductive areas. If we take the 30s to the 40s, which was the first known medical warnings about harm to babies and diapers, to the 2022 global discontinuation, that's about 90 years. So yeah, they wait a lot of years before all this stuff happens, right? Before they even start to figure out that something's wrong. But companies then often argue that studies showing harm are inconclusive, while continuing to profit for decades. For example, Johnson & Johnson insisted baby powder was safe despite decades of independent research showing otherwise. They only shifted once lawsuits, declining sales, and public scrutiny made it more costly to keep selling them than to stop. Similar patterns are seen with tobacco, lead paint, asbestos, Roundup, PFAS, and the forever chemicals and the opioids. So, in the U.S., talcum powder was never banned, even as internal memos. So yeah, it took them years and years and years. I mean, they knew, and they were starting to get in trouble with it, and they knew they didn't do anything for 40 or 50 years. And here's the part you need to pay attention to. They only stopped the Johnson & Johnson people from, baby powder is really, they got out of mines. It's like asbestos or something, right? Very dangerous stuff. So what they did was, in 2022, they finally said, oh, I guess we'll give up. We're not going to sell any more of this. I guess we killed enough babies now. And so what happened was this, and this is the reason I'm suspicious. It meant that they had to stop selling it. Nothing was said about what they did with products they had they could still distribute. So here is my suspicion. Just like the bad baby food being promoted to poor countries, I think if you look around your own country, you will probably find this baby formula pattern stuff, this Johnson & Johnson baby talcum. That stuff is probably being sold in other countries. It is very, very dangerous. And this gives you an insight into, even when the public rears up and said this is dangerous, they can fight it off for 50, 60, 70 years before they're willing to do anything, okay? What we've seen is that power always hides behind a story, whether it's priests in white linen, doctors in white coats, or universities claiming to serve the truth. The uniform changes, but the function always remains the same: to preserve their own authority, to sanctify exploitation, and to pass on to the next generation as if it were natural. People now think, well, yeah, we've always used disposable diapers, let's just keep using them. No, that wasn't what always used to happen. Babies are literally being traumatized by this diaper thing. So yeah, I hope you'll listen to that clip. I have it down below. It is insanity, the psychological damage that just something like this diaper trick is doing to living children right at this moment as I speak. So, you know, by tracking these patterns of slavery, the debt, the religion, the science, the borders, we see that nothing is inevitable. It's all been engineered. The official story is never the whole story. We need to continue pulling back the covers, and when I return, what I'm going to be doing is picking off their biggest crimes one by one. But I must close off this file right now. Be safe out there, and goodbye for now. and try your best. Don't judge anybody by their cover. Try to look beyond it. I've been doing some work to try to figure out some of the trauma in this country, and it is horrifying. It is horrifying. I now believe that the government used a lot of military children in their testing, and I found the direct connection to that. There were about 3 million children right after World War II. Our parents fought in that war. The boomer generation was likely the first generation of kids they started testing on way before the MK7 stuff. Yeah, they had us like set up from the very beginning, just like they set us up with a preacher, a doctor, and a sheriff in every town, right? And people think they need to have camera in our houses? Well, of course not. We're lined up with these people. Tread with caution. You have any, and I mean any, interaction with these people. They put the ones that have the nicest smile in front of our faces, but remember, if they're on the screen, they're probably on the team, and they all back each other up. They all lie for either side. So anyway, be safe out there, and goodbye.